for a long time, people said, well, it's just science fiction. Have to throw off this unnecessary acceptance of aging because now it's within our grasp to change it.
I'm here with David Wood, who co-authored The Death of Death with Jose Cordero. Thank you for your time and being here. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the longevity industry, a little bit about what you do and how you came to be where you are?
My background's in software. I worked in the early days of the mobile computing and smartphone industries. That's back in the 1980s, 1990s. I realized that we could reprogram our computers. And then I realized we probably could reprogram our biology. And I realized that reprogramming our biology would likely have an even bigger impact on human life than reprogramming our technologies.
Okay. And what are you working on now to that end?
I have quite a few different hats. One of my hats is as a futurist. I chair an organization called London Futurists, which has been running since 2008. So 17 years now, in which I've chaired meetings, more than 350 meetings, with people discussing their ideas on radical future possibilities. How the world might be significantly different in just a decade or even less than it is today. And what is credible in terms of these scenarios, because sometimes people shrug their shoulders and say, this sounds like science fiction. How can we distinguish credible possibilities from non-credible ones? And just as difficult, how do we figure out what's desirable, truly desirable, as opposed to just superficially desirable, and what's something we should fear, rather than something that just gives us a momentary degree of uncertainty and a feeling of, oh, I'm not sure about this.
Okay. And how much of a play does science fiction play in that? Because people watch shows all the time, and the cell phone is the classic example. Everyone has one now, but back when Star Trek first came out, nobody had ever heard of the communicator. It was a wild technological thing. But if you look at what the communicator was, we would laugh at someone using that today. But I think it's because of that introduction through sci-fi that people even had the concept of the possibility in mind and to have the desire for it and maybe help to bring that about. So do you think there's a correlation there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
People who are creative, they explore ideas. Sometimes they do it for entertainment purposes. Sometimes they do it just to tell a story, and they don't care about the accuracy. But in the midst of all this, sometimes there is a prefiguring of what's to come. So famously, H.G. Wells, and I think about 1907, wrote a book in which there were nuclear weapons. And for a long time, people said, well, it's just science fiction. Even the great physicists like Einstein, who had come up with the idea that actually there could be energy in the nucleus, he dismissed the idea that there could be any sustainable access to this until it was pointed out there could be a mechanism after all involving a newfangled thing called the neutron. And you and I probably learned about neutrons in our grandmother's knee. But until 1932, there was no knowledge of such a thing. And when they were invented or discovered, I should say, then people realized they could be in a chain reaction. So sometimes science fiction gets a little bit of the forecast correctly, and it has the details wrong. But that doesn't mean to say we can dismiss science fiction. On the contrary, a great deal of science fiction can help to make us think. So what we need is the skills of creativity to imagine new possibilities, but then also critical thinking to figure out, well, what's actually feasible here.
Right. How do we make it real within reality? And
Yeah.
okay.
After all, I think the communicator, as I remember, had instantaneous communication everywhere, whereas in reality, our mobile phones are still bound by the speed of light, and it's probably going to remain that way even forever.
That is true. There probably wasn't a satellite or cell phone towers in space going from the Enterprise to whatever planet. So
Right.
that's a good point. All right. So you said you wear multiple hats. Futurist is one. What other hats do you have?
So I'm also the executive director of the LEV Foundation
Oh, with Aubrey de Grey.
with Aubrey de Grey, yes. So
Okay.
that's Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. So Aubrey is the scientific visionary, the grand strategist. He has incredible knowledge of capabilities of different medical approaches, different biochemistry. also get a good understanding of theories of change, what's actually going to change people's opinion around the world about the desirability of conquering aging. But it's
Okay.
my role to run the management team to ensure that we keep all our processes in place and that people are looked after and so on.
Okay,
And you
so he
need
gets
both
the
kinds of
fun
discipline.
job, and you have to make sure it all stays above board.
Well, my job's fun too.
Okay, uh, touche.
Yeah.
All right,
Looking after the details is an important thing, you
it
know?
is. Yeah. All right. So within that, I'm sure you meet a lot of people, obviously Aubrey, but the people he engages with as well as fellow researchers and all of that. Is there something that you can point to as a common denominator that all of them run into as a roadblock that's slowing down their progress?
Well, a very common roadblock is lack of funds. To be clear,
Lack of funds.
there are lots of fascinating ideas which deserve more research. We've had many of them at this conference, but again and again, the question has been, well, why can't you make faster progress? And the answer is, well, if I had another $30 million, we could hire more people, we could go faster. So that is one issue. We are not very good as a species at allocating our resources on truly the most fundamental or the most important issues. We tend to get distracted, so we spend much more money on what? Coming up with new flavors of ice cream, new vapes to make people want to vape more, or famously, a lot of the cleverest people are employed to make people click on adverts.
Hmm.
So that's how we are slightly badly organized, and we need to be better at allocating resources to the things that could have the biggest payback.
Okay.
That's not the only obstacle. There's also limitations in thinking. And our thinking is constrained by our past, it's constrained by what other people around us say, it's constrained by ideas, well, this is how we do things here. And a lot of the laws and processes, originally they were put in place for a good reason. And often you're kind of reacting against a mistake that took place in the past. So you put a process in place or a law in place or regulations in place to address that. But it turns out that when time moves forward, these are no longer necessarily the right and best regulations. A famous example is in the nuclear power industry. Let's go back to this example of nuclear energy. And we haven't made anything like as much progress as could have been the case with coming up with new generations of nuclear power reactors. And in part, it's because we got worried about some disasters or near disasters like 3 Mile Island or Fukushima in Japan. And there was an incident, I think, in Russia as well. Chernobyl, yeah,
Yeah.
somewhere in the Soviet Union. So naturally, people said, hey, we got to be more careful with this stuff. And that's reasonable. But a lot of the rules that are in place probably are less applicable to some of the new types of nuclear reactor. I'm not saying we should throw the rule book away. I'm saying we need to be better at adapting it in a flexible and, let's use the word, agile way. Agile is one of my favorite words in terms of how we should operate.
Okay. So to kind of recap that, as far as answering the question of the roadblocks, funding is, one of the big ones. And then beyond that is the thinking. People have to step outside of, as Jim Stroll calls it, that death programming, and see more of like, hey, this is a real thing. And also realize that some of the rules that have been set in place many, many years ago maybe were great then, but
Yeah,
aren't so applicable now because things evolve and change over time.
yeah.
So maybe we need to rethink regulation as well. Did I sum that up
That's
about
fair,
right?
yes.
Okay.
And the regulations should never be an end in themselves. And the regulations are trying to serve some higher purpose. If we lose sight of that higher purpose, then the regulations become an end in themselves. But sometimes people say, well, we've got to show that we're following the process because we've got to show that we're being fair. We've got to show that we're not prejudiced. We've got to show that we're giving everybody an equal chance. But if we're just dominated by these thinking, we won't build more broadly, I call it a sustainable superabundance, which is within our grasp. It's like people shied away from innovations in nuclear power stations because there was just too much of a regulatory burden to address. And we lost the skills in many ways. So now it's much more expensive to develop this stuff than it should have been.
I wonder if there's a play too, and relating that to longevity and why people shy away from it. So for the nuclear power plants, people shied away because of the dangers, like 3 Mile Island and
Yep.
Chernobyl. So maybe in longevity, maybe there's that aspect of fear and shying away from it because of the thousands of years of programming of religion and how, yeah, it's part of whichever God's will to have to die to then go on to the promised land. Is that something?
Absolutely. So there is something which is occasionally called the wise philosophy, where wise philosophy is inside inverted commas, because people say, well, the truly wise thing to do is to accept your fate. And Buddha said a lot of this cause of suffering is because of desire. So many Buddhists teach that you've got to look at dead bodies and accept them. You know, there's no point trying to fight against it. If you fight against it, it'll just cause more problems. And there's a famous prayer which the theologian Rudolf Niebuhr, I forget his name now, he popularized. It says, "May God grant me the grace to accept what I cannot change."
The serenity prayer.
The Serenity Prayer. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe grant me the serenity to accept what I cannot change. But prayer doesn't stop there. It goes on with two more clauses. One of them is, give me the courage to change what I can change, and give me the wisdom to know the difference between these two cases. So there was a lot of things that we couldn't change in the past. And so it was a waste of time to get your hopes up. You know, you had to concentrate on what you could change rather than what you couldn't change. Now it turns out that we can change things which weren't possible in the past. And so we have to take matters into our own hands, and that requires overcoming that long history and culture, which tells us, be wise. But it's not actually being wise anymore, it's being timid. Like people were told, you've got to accept slavery. Slavery is how the world has always operated. There were many people who thought, well, it's not very nice, but how could society operate without slaves? After all, if you look at many of the world's most venerable holy books from multiple religious traditions, there's no commandment in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not keep slaves.
That's a
There's a
good point.
commandment that says, don't envy your neighbor's slave. After the commandment that says, don't envy your neighbor's wife, and before the commandment that says, don't envy your neighbor's ox or ass. If you dive more deeply into the book of Leviticus and so on, there are many rules say, if you beat your slave and your slave dies, that's a bad thing. You shouldn't do that. If you beat your slave and the slave recovers, that's probably all right because the slave's your property. I may be paraphrasing. There's lots of parts which don't get preached from the pulpit every Sunday because, frankly, we've moved on as a society. But for a long time, it was thought we had to have slavery. You couldn't have a proper economy otherwise. But there were people around the world, and a lot of it happened in Britain, as it turns out. There was a group of very effective entrepreneurs who got together with one writer and with some philosophers, and they said, you know what, we're going to change this, even though it means taking an economic hit, even though it means having to pay compensation to existing slave traders or people whose businesses depend upon slaves. We're going to do this because it's a better future in which we have abolished slavery. In the same way, I talk about the abolition of aging. Before I cooperated with Jose Cordero to create The Death of Death, I wrote another book in 2015, came out in 2016, called The Abolition of Aging,
Okay.
and said, we have to throw off this so-called wise philosophy, this unnecessary acceptance of aging, because now it's within our grasp to change it.
Okay, it's interesting. As you were saying that, I was like, "Oh, I was just reading about this," and it took a minute to click that I had just finished reading *The Death of Death* about a week ago, and that's where I was reading it. That makes perfect sense.
Right.
So, I think that makes a lot of sense that really a decision may come, and it's a good decision when it happens as a society, but it needs to not stop there, and then in the future, like, "Oh, 50 years ago, we decided, this was a good decision, so that's just what it
Right.
is." We need to rethink these decisions
Yes.
all the time as time evolves, as society evolves, and that, uh, can keep us on that leading edge of, thought and creation and
That's
evolution
right.
and what we're actually capable of. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. So keep the true end in mind rather than becoming worshipping a set of rules or a set of regulations just because they were handed down to us from the past or because political leaders in the previous government thought they were the right thing.
Okay, very good. Well, I think that about wraps up our time. Our clock our guy with the clock is gone. But is there anything you would like to say to the viewers that they could do to help themselves? Something they could do to help you in your cause? Just any final words on that?
Well, we need to keep learning. None of us know all the answers to the challenges ahead. And it's not just learning the science and the medicine and the engineering. We need to do all of that. We need to be good at bioengineering. But even more than that, we need to be good at engineering how we cooperate. Collaboration is our greatest human asset. It's our super skill, if you like. Uh, and collaboration means, tapping into each other's abilities, tapping into each other's insights. And as a society, we need to figure out how we can collaborate together well. And by the way, a lot of progress in the field that I come from, software, arose because people could collaborate on bigger projects than ever before. There's something called open source, which was a shocking idea at the time. How could it possibly work? It's going to be chaos. It's going to be people introducing all kinds of bugs. It turns out when you have a few right processes, people could write much more powerful software, often by the methods of open source. Wikipedia is another example. It's not perfect by any means. There's areas of Wikipedia which I'm not happy with, but on the whole, it's an incredible creation by collaboration. So now we are challenged. Can we truly cooperate to build the sustainable superabundance of which super longevity is a key part? And we're not going to do that by just ourselves as individuals.
So we need
We
to
have to
work
do it. We
together
have to work
and
together, and that means reevaluating what are our processes for working together.
okay, so let's collaborate and save all of our lives.
Absolutely.
Mr. David Wood, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.